Fees and funding. This is the somewhat less good news, I'm afraid. The fees look like this at the moment. I don't think you'll find anybody teaching in universities who is particularly happy with this situation, but this is the situation that we have to deal with. These are flat rates that are set at university level, and so they are what is given to us to work with. So for UK and other EU students, we are, for current purposes, emphatically still in the EU until and unless anyone says we're not, and there will almost certainly be some kind of guarantee that what applies to the UK also applies to the EU 27 countries for at least the coming year. The UK-EU fee is £9,500 for the 1 year, 12-month full-time course. The international fee for students outside the EU is about twice that, £18,500, and the part-time fee is 50% of that in each year, so it comes to the same. And for the UK-EU, it'll probably go up slightly in the second year, just in line with inflation. Okay, so that is obviously a fairly substantial fee. It's in the same region as the undergraduate fees, and it does not have the level of loan arrangement that undergraduate fees have. There is a national loan scheme. You can find the details on this government website, and the important thing to notice about it, so our fees, our full-time fee is £9,500. The maximum value of the loan is only £10,600. So you can take out a loan that will slightly more than cover your fees. It doesn't, and it's not designed to cover a full living allowance. So unfortunately, nobody can actually get by on a loan. The way people finance themselves, they save up in advance, or they are occasionally able to get external funding, which I'll talk about in a moment. Quite a lot of students now look at the part-time route and study part-time while they're working other jobs. And as has been said previously, we have our timetables arranged to make that as easy as possible. So most of the time, if you are a part-timer, you will be attending either 1 or 2 days per week on campus. Sometimes there are optional events on other days, but in terms of what you're actually required to do, you don't normally have to be here more than 2 days a week, and the scheduling is as regular as possible. So it is typically, it's the same 2 days, or it moves in a pattern that you know about several months in advance, so that you can sort those details out with employers. And it has worked out well for the vast majority of the people who've come and studied part-time. Other things you should know about this loan scheme. It's available to UK and other EU students, but because of the way British higher education works, we hit the really complicated boundaries between England and the rest of the UK. So one of the requirements is that you have to normally live in England. Nobody's absolutely sure what that means. I'm not sure they knew what they meant when they specified this. Basically, if you are, for instance, Scottish, but you've been living consistently in England for the past 3 years, then you are probably fine. If you are Scottish, but you have just moved to England for the purposes of studying at an English university, then you are typically not eligible. If you're something somewhere between the two, then you literally have to phone up and ask what the position is likely to be, unfortunately. This is another situation which I really wish was not the case. If you are an EU 27 student, then the residency requirements are slightly different. You don't have to have been living in the UK, you can have been living in an EEA country, provided you've been doing it consistently. Again, look at the website, the government website. If that doesn't help, phone them up and ask what the position is. There is an age limit on it. I don't think we've got any intercalating medics in the room, but just for the purposes of the recording, if you are a medical student, if you want to take this as an intercalation, you are typically eligible, but do check. And the interest rate is, so it's the retail price index plus 3%, and unfortunately, if you have undergraduate debts, then you end up paying back the two things concurrently, so it increases your total payments. It's not a great scheme, but it does allow a certain number of people to study who wouldn't otherwise be able to. Now, funding possibilities. Each year, a limited number of students is able to get national level funding which allows them to study. It pays fees. It also pays a relatively generous living allowance, it varies from scheme to scheme, but it's typically something like £14,000 per year, which, because you would be a full-time student, would be tax-free. For EU27 students, all of the, national level, all of the same funding is available. It works in exactly the same way, except that it just pays the fees, doesn't pay the living allowance. Now, these schemes, unfortunately, the government doesn't give them out for the purposes of funding people just to do a master's. Okay, they give them out specifically for research preparation. So they are mainly designed in terms of funding people through PhDs, so the 3 years of a full-time postgraduate research program. The reason we look at them for master's funding is that it is sometimes possible to include a master's year, so what's called a 1+3. So the 1 year of master's, the 3 years of PhD. But the two things are never separated out for government schemes, not these days, unfortunately. The only way this can happen is if you have a clear idea before you start the master's of a particular research career that you have in mind, of a particular research project, and you put in a proposal that specifies what the PhD is going to be like and how the master's is going to help you to get it. Now, in practice, this typically happens because a potential student comes and talks to somebody like me, a program director, and says, these are my interests. And I say, oh, have you talked to this person, somebody who would be a good person to supervise in that area? And they go off and have that meeting. And then the supervisor says, I think this person would be a good possibility as a PhD student. And the supervisor helps them to define a research proposal. And then that goes in. And it's relatively unusual because there isn't that much funding out there, but it does happen. Okay, so we have helped people with several of these proposals. We have got several masters and then PhD students as a result. Now, that's the government scheme. The only government-funded council, there are several different research councils dealing with particular areas. The only one that's currently funding projects that we can take in that area is the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council, okay, which deals with economics, obviously, most of the social sciences, sociology, various other fields, which does cover the social history of science, technology, and medicine. Okay, so it's possible to apply for that. The final deadline is Monday, the 4th of February. You will need to start talking to potential supervisors somewhat before that time, if you want to go down that route. Okay, and you would need to actually apply for a place on the programme before you put in the application for funding. There is also the Wellcome Trust. The Wellcome Trust is different because it's not a government funding scheme. It's an independent charitable body with an awful lot of money to spend on various things, which chooses to spend some of it on funding postgraduates in the history of medicine and the medical humanities. Now, this one's unusual because the master's funding is separated out from PhD funding. It still only goes to people who are likely to be able to develop a research career, but the application for the master's funding is a one-off process, and unlike the arrangement where the student applies directly to the funder, here the funder, the Wellcome Trust, has given the funding to us, to CHSTM. Okay, and so you would apply to us, to be the student who gets that funding. That process is handled by my colleague Rob Kirk, who is a historian of medicine, amongst other things, and who knows these processes very well. The details for this scheme, which has a slightly later deadline, are on the CHSTM website on the funding page, for which the link is at the bottom there. So if you think you might be a possibility for either of these routes, then talk to the appropriate people. That would be Rob for the Wellcome Trust funding, or for, if you think you might be a possibility for ESRC funding, you can talk to me in the first instance, or if you already know of a potential supervisor who you think might be helpful, then talk to them directly. So, in principle, I think the Wellcome funding is committed to the HSTM route, obviously specifically for history of medicine or relevant areas. ESRC funding, we've most usually got it for the HSTM programme. On one occasion, we've got it for medical humanities. We've never got it for science communication before, but in principle, it could very easily happen. And it's also worth pointing out, we, the staff, ourselves keep putting in applications for other kinds of scheme where, rather than the funding going directly to a student, it goes to us. So an individual supervisor gets the funding and then gets to recruit a student. We don't have any of these right at the moment. People are putting in applications to different schemes all the time. Several of our current PhD students were funded through that route, and that has included people who've done a master's as well as a PhD. So in fact, one of our current master's students, Robert Naylor, was funded through that process. If we get one of these things, then the details of it will again appear on the CHSTM website at that address. And it's always worth looking at the university's funding database. They do their best to keep it up to date. Occasionally they will spot funding opportunities that we don't, so keep an eye on that one as well.